There was always something strangely unstable about the way Green Arrow occupied space inside the moral architecture of the DC Comics universe. Not because he killed. The DC universe has always found ways to metabolize violence. Gods destroy cities, vigilantes break bones in alleyways, lanterns erase armies from orbit, and entire universes collapse every few publishing cycles beneath the weight of continuity itself. Violence was never the contradiction. The contradiction was rhetorical. Green Arrow insisted on speaking the language of compassion while repeatedly returning to methods rooted in humiliation, intimidation, surveillance, and punitive force. He positioned himself as a defender of ordinary people while operating through mechanisms that increasingly resembled occupation. That tension became invisible partly because Oliver Queen arrived wrapped in cultural familiarity. The beard, the sarcasm, the anti-establishment posture, the public outrage directed upward toward corporations, corruption, systemic inequality. He entered the stage carrying the visual language of resistance. A billionaire who hated billionaires. A vigilante who distrusted authority. A hero who spoke like a man standing outside the empire rather than helping maintain it. The image was clean, almost comforting, especially compared to figures like the Punisher, whose brutality was designed to feel abrasive from the start. But fictional morality rarely reveals itself through declared values. It reveals itself through behavioral gravity, through recurring instinct, through what a character repeatedly does once pressure begins collapsing the distance between self-image and impulse. And over time, Green Arrow's orbit kept pulling him toward the same territory occupied by the very figures he was culturally positioned against. The difference was aesthetic framing. Frank Castle looked like punishment. Oliver Queen looked like conscience. One dressed his violence in trauma. The other dressed it in moral enlightenment. That distinction matters more than it first appears, because modern superhero mythology no longer operates primarily through actions. It operates through symbolic branding. Characters are not judged according to structural behavior, but according to emotional presentation. Anger can be interpreted as empathy if aimed at the correct targets. Surveillance can feel virtuous if framed as protection. Humiliation can become morally invisible if performed in the name of social justice. Fictional violence no longer requires restraint to remain heroic. It merely requires ideological alignment with the audience consuming it. And that is where Green Arrow becomes culturally dangerous in a way more explicit vigilantes often do not. Punisher announces his pathology openly. He stands in the middle of the stage like a public wound. The audience may admire him, fear him, reject him, romanticize him, but the brutality is visible. Green Arrow, meanwhile, often functions as a fantasy of moral immunity. A character allowed to weaponize aggression while preserving the emotional comfort of believing himself compassionate. The arrow enters the body already justified. This is partly why the character became increasingly important during periods of political polarization inside American culture. Oliver Queen offered a specific fantasy to liberal audiences exhausted by corruption, inequality, institutional failure, and reactionary power structures. He represented the dream that righteous anger could remain righteous indefinitely, that force could be purified through intention, that violence aimed upward somehow escaped becoming violence at all. He became less a superhero than a psychological compromise between empathy and vengeance. The deeper contradiction is that Green Arrow rarely behaves like someone attempting to reduce violence. He behaves like someone attempting to morally curate it. Certain targets deserve humiliation. Certain people deserve intimidation. Certain lives become narratively disposable once absorbed into symbolic categories like corruption, extremism, exploitation, or criminality. His arrows may be less lethal than bullets in many incarnations, but the psychological structure remains remarkably similar. Punishment first, reflection later, sometimes never. And yet the DC universe continually frames Oliver as one of its moral centers. The outspoken conscience inside rooms filled with gods and soldiers. The man willing to tell uncomfortable truths. The progressive corrective to authoritarian heroes like Batman or Superman. He occupies the symbolic territory of ethical clarity. The problem is that his methods increasingly destabilize the very moral distinction the narrative insists on preserving. Because once violence becomes psychologically pleasurable, once humiliation becomes performative, once moral certainty begins feeding on public spectacle, ideological language stops functioning as restraint and starts functioning as camouflage. The city changes shape beneath that pressure. Streets become stages for ethical theater. Criminals become containers for projected rage. Justice becomes less about repairing civic space and more about emotionally satisfying the audience's desire to watch power punished. And Oliver Queen often looks disturbingly comfortable there. The question underneath Green Arrow was never whether he cared about injustice. He clearly does. The question is what happens when outrage becomes identity. When political morality fuses with vigilante psychology. When a man begins believing his anger remains inherently virtuous simply because he can still articulate it through the language of compassion. At that point, the boundary between protector and punisher does not disappear dramatically. It erodes quietly, one rationalization at a time. That erosion sits at the center of modern superhero morality itself. Not only inside Green Arrow stories, but across contemporary pop mythology as a whole. The audience increasingly demands heroes who speak the language of empathy while delivering the emotional satisfaction of domination. Heroes who condemn brutality rhetorically while exercising it aesthetically. Heroes who promise liberation while maintaining absolute control over who deserves mercy and who does not. Green Arrow did not create that contradiction, but he may embody it more clearly than almost anyone else in modern comics. Green Arrow was not originally built to carry this kind of symbolic weight. In his earliest form, Oliver Queen existed as an echo, a reflection projected outward from the overwhelming gravitational center of Batman, the millionaire vigilante, the trick arrows replacing gadgets, the psychic replacing Robin, the cave replaced by the Arrow Cave. Even the rhythm of the stories carried that same architectural DNA, urban crime filtered through theatrical vigilantism. At first glance, there was little psychological distinction between them beyond aesthetics. But imitation inside superhero mythology rarely remains static. Over time, copies drift. They absorb historical pressure. Cultural anxiety reshapes them into unintended opposites. And by the late 20th century, Oliver Queen had undergone a transformation that permanently altered his symbolic territory within the DC universe. Writers increasingly repositioned him not as a detective aristocrat managing chaos from above, but as a politically vocal populist. A loud conscience standing inside an industry historically more comfortable with abstraction than ideology. That evolution mattered because it aligned Green Arrow with a changing cultural landscape. American distrust toward institutions was expanding. Corporate cynicism was becoming mainstream. Public faith in systems of power was eroding beneath economic instability, war fatigue, political scandal, and widening social fracture. Oliver Queen became a vessel capable of carrying that frustration directly into superhero fiction. Unlike Superman, he did not embody transcendent moral certainty. Unlike Batman, he did not retreat into obsessive control disguised as order. Oliver operated through visible irritation. He sounded angry. More importantly, he sounded disappointed. That disappointment became central to his identity. Not merely disappointment with criminals, but disappointment with society itself. With greed, with corruption, with systemic neglect. His politics positioned him psychologically closer to the wounded citizen than the distant mythic guardian. He was not framed as above the city. He appeared trapped inside it, breathing its pollution, reacting to its failures in real time. That proximity generated authenticity. It also generated instability, because Oliver Queen never truly resolves the contradiction between compassion and domination. He merely narrates around it more effectively than many other vigilantes. Unlike the Punisher, whose worldview emerges from catastrophic personal trauma transformed into permanent war psychology, Green Arrow's aggression often emerges through moral disgust. He looks at corruption and experiences rage not simply because it causes harm, but because it violates his emotional image of what society should be. That distinction appears noble initially, yet psychologically, it creates a dangerous structure. The vigilante no longer sees himself merely protecting victims. He begins experiencing himself as the corrective force against a morally contaminated world. And corrective identities tend to radicalize over time. The city itself becomes psychologically important here. In superhero fiction, cities rarely function as neutral environments. Gotham is Gothic collapse. Metropolis is aspirational modernity. Star City, particularly in Green Arrow stories, increasingly becomes a battlefield of inequality, exploitation, corruption, privatization, addiction, and institutional abandonment. It resembles an occupied territory where civic structures have already failed long before the vigilante enters the frame. That matters because failed systems psychologically legitimize exceptional force. The more broken the environment appears, the more audiences tolerate authoritarian behavior from those claiming to defend it. This is one reason Oliver Queen remains culturally easier to forgive than Frank Castle. Punisher often feels detached from civic repair entirely. His war never ends because resolution would destroy the identity built around conflict itself. Green Arrow, meanwhile, frames his aggression through restoration. He claims to fight so the city might heal. But restoration narratives can become psychologically deceptive, especially when the hero increasingly relies on coercion to sustain the fantasy of order. That tension becomes even clearer when examining Oliver's relationship with wealth. Superhero billionaires traditionally embody distance from ordinary vulnerability. Wealth creates elevation, separation from consequence. Bruce Wayne transforms that privilege into obsessive discipline. Tony Stark transforms it into technological dominance. Oliver Queen attempts something different. He symbolically rejects his own class position. He speaks against corporate exploitation, criticizes economic inequality, aligns rhetorically with workers and marginalized communities. But the contradiction never fully disappears because his power still operates through unilateral control. He decides who deserves intervention. He surveils the city from above. He weaponizes resources inaccessible to ordinary citizens. Even his political outrage often carries traces of aristocratic frustration, the anger of a man shocked that the kingdom beneath him remains impure despite his awareness of its suffering. His compassion is genuine, so is his need for authority. The two impulses coexist uneasily, producing a hero constantly oscillating between empathy and punishment. And superhero fiction tends to reward that oscillation rather than interrogate it. The genre itself evolved through similar contradictions. Early superheroes emerged during periods of institutional fragility, economic collapse, global war, urban crime panic. They offered fantasies of intervention, where systems appeared incapable of protecting ordinary people. But contemporary superhero morality increasingly demands something more psychologically complicated. Audiences now expect heroes not only to defeat threats, but to perform ethical awareness publicly. They must appear emotionally intelligent, socially conscious, politically awake. Violence alone no longer secures legitimacy. Violence must now be narratively moralized. Green Arrow fits this environment perfectly because he already speaks the language contemporary audiences associate with ethical consciousness. He critiques inequality, questions authority, defends marginalized people, condemns corruption. Yet beneath that rhetorical structure remains a vigilante whose solutions still depend heavily on domination, intimidation, and force. The costume changes. The psychology often does not. This is why comparisons between Green Arrow and Punisher become increasingly difficult to avoid. Superficially, they appear oppositional. Frank Castle represents reactionary absolutism stripped of optimism. Oliver Queen represents progressive outrage filtered through social conscience. One sees the world as irredeemable. The other claims to fight for a better version of it. But structurally, both men process social failure through personalized violence. Both externalize frustration onto symbolic enemies. Both reduce systemic collapse into targets requiring elimination or suppression. Both operate through private moral authority unconstrained by democratic accountability. And both derive psychological coherence from conflict itself. The difference lies primarily in narrative framing and emotional presentation. Frank Castle is allowed to look monstrous. Oliver Queen is often encouraged to look righteous. That distinction profoundly shapes audience perception. Modern media environments reward symbolic alignment over behavioral consistency. Audiences increasingly interpret morality through tribal language rather than structural analysis. If a character signals the correct values, contradictions become easier to ignore. Aggression becomes cathartic rather than alarming. Cruelty becomes understandable. Public humiliation becomes morally acceptable if directed towards socially designated villains. Green Arrow exists directly inside that cultural shift. His sarcasm becomes social intelligence. His anger becomes authenticity. His intimidation becomes necessary urgency. His surveillance becomes responsibility. Even lethal force, when it appears, often receives softer moral treatment because the narrative foregrounds Oliver's intentions rather than the authoritarian implications of his methods. The audience is encouraged to emotionally experience his violence as ethical frustration rather than domination. But violence does not psychologically transform because the perpetrator articulates progressive ideals while performing it. That is the deeper fracture beneath Green Arrow's mythology. He sincerely believes himself compassionate. The narratives surrounding him often agree. Yet again and again, his solutions reveal a man increasingly comfortable exercising unilateral force against those he perceives as contaminating the civic body. The city becomes morally divided terrain. Some citizens deserve protection. Others become obstacles, targets, symbols of societal decay requiring correction. Once a vigilante begins categorizing people this way, the distance between reformer and punisher narrows dramatically. And the DC universe often refuses to fully confront that narrowing because Oliver Queen performs too important a symbolic function inside the broader mythology. He acts as the internal critic, the man who speaks uncomfortable truths to power, the hero positioned closest to ordinary political consciousness, a corrective mechanism against the detached grandeur of gods and cosmic saviors. But corrective figures are not automatically humane. Sometimes they merely redirect the location of acceptable brutality. The contradiction inside Green Arrow becomes impossible to ignore once the stories stop treating violence as abstract superhero choreography and begin anchoring it to political frustration. Earlier comic eras often insulated vigilantism through theatrical unreality. Henchmen collapsed without consequence. Cities absorbed destruction like dream logic. Moral clarity remained intact because the environment itself functioned symbolically rather than materially. But as superhero fiction moved toward greater psychological realism, the implications surrounding Oliver Queen's methods became harder to narratively contain, especially because Green Arrow was one of the few DC heroes explicitly positioned as politically conscious. That shift fundamentally altered the emotional weight of his actions. When Batman brutalizes criminals, the violence often exists inside Gothic abstraction. Gotham operates like mythic nightmare territory, detached from ordinary civic logic. But Star City increasingly resembled recognizable urban collapse. Corrupt landlords, exploitative corporations, drug epidemics, economic abandonment, institutional rot. Oliver's targets no longer represented purely theatrical evil. They represented social pathology. The stories wanted readers to understand the anger politically. And political anger changes the psychological meaning of force. Because once violence becomes attached to ideological conviction, it begins acquiring moral insulation. The hero no longer experiences aggression merely as necessary intervention. He experiences it as ethical obligation, a response demanded by history itself. The city becomes an arena of permanent emergency, where hesitation appears indistinguishable from complicity. Under those conditions, restraint starts feeling emotionally irrational. This is where Green Arrow gradually stops functioning as a traditional liberal figure and starts resembling something far more unstable. Classical liberal morality depends heavily on procedural limits. Institutions, rights, due process, structural protections against concentrated force. But Oliver Queen repeatedly bypasses those principles whenever emotional urgency enters the frame. He does not trust systems to repair harm quickly enough. So the vigilante identity expands to compensate for institutional failure. That expansion is psychologically seductive because it transforms frustration into agency. The powerless citizen watches corruption persist despite public outrage. The vigilante bypasses paralysis entirely. He acts, he confronts, he humiliates, he punishes, and because Oliver articulates his anger through socially conscious rhetoric, the audience often experiences that escalation not as authoritarian drift, but as moral courage. The emotional architecture surrounding the character converts domination into catharsis. The arrow itself becomes symbolically important here. Unlike firearms, arrows retain traces of intimacy, precision, craftsmanship, physical effort. They feel older than modern violence, almost ceremonial. The weapon creates aesthetic distance from the brutality it produces. A sniper rifle implies mechanized death. An arrow suggests skill, discipline, intentionality. Green Arrow benefits enormously from that symbolic framing, because it softens the audience's perception of coercion. But the body does not experience symbolic nuance. It experiences penetration, and over time, Oliver's methods increasingly reveal a man comfortable weaponizing fear. He stalks, monitors, interrogates, publicly humiliates criminals, invades spaces through unilateral authority. Even in non-lethal portrayals, his violence often carries performative dimensions designed not simply to stop threats, but to establish psychological dominance over them. The city learns to fear him as much as trust him. That duality becomes central to his power, which is precisely where the comparison to the Punisher stops feeling rhetorical and starts feeling structural. Frank Castle embodies punitive absolutism openly. His worldview collapses morality into warfare. Criminality becomes contamination requiring eradication. Green Arrow officially rejects that framework. He speaks the language of reform, compassion, social responsibility. Yet his actions repeatedly drift towards similar conclusions whenever systemic frustration intensifies. The criminal increasingly stops appearing as a damaged human being trapped within social collapse, and instead becomes an emotional outlet for Oliver's rage toward the larger failures of society. That psychological displacement matters enormously, because neither Punisher nor Green Arrow truly attacks systems directly. Systems are too large, too abstract, too resilient. Instead, both characters externalize societal failure onto visible human targets. The corrupt businessman, the trafficker, the gang leader, the abusive politician. Individual enemies become symbolic containers holding the emotional weight of broader civic decay. Violence against them produces temporary feelings of restored moral order, but only temporarily. The city never heals because the underlying conflict is psychological as much as structural. Oliver Queen does not merely hate corruption. He hates helplessness. He hates witnessing suffering without immediate corrective power. The vigilante identity allows him to temporarily escape the unbearable recognition that social collapse cannot be solved through individual force. Yet superhero fiction repeatedly rewards that fantasy by framing visible intervention as meaningful transformation. This creates a feedback loop between audience desire and narrative escalation. Readers increasingly crave heroes who express contemporary outrage directly. Detached moral idealism begins feeling emotionally insufficient during periods of political fragmentation and institutional distrust. Characters who visibly rage against exploitation feel more authentic than those maintaining distant ethical restraint. Green Arrow adapts perfectly to that emotional environment because his anger appears socially aware rather than reactionary. But psychologically, outrage does not become safer simply because its rhetoric changes. In fact, moral certainty often intensifies aggression because the individual no longer experiences internal conflict about exercising force. Oliver rarely perceives himself as dangerous. That absence of self-suspicion becomes one of the character's most revealing traits. Punisher understands his own monstrosity on some level, even if he cannot escape it. Green Arrow often perceives his violence as fundamentally moderated by compassion. The narrative frequently reinforces that belief. Yet compassion without restraint easily mutates into paternalism. Oliver increasingly behaves like a man who believes he knows what society should become and therefore feels justified imposing corrective pressure against those obstructing that vision. Criminals stop functioning as citizens beneath law and start functioning as enemies beneath moral legitimacy. Once that shift occurs, coercion begins feeling emotionally clean. The vigilante no longer asks whether he should exercise force. He asks only whether the target deserves it. And modern superhero storytelling quietly encourages that transition because it mirrors broader cultural dynamics surrounding morality and visibility. Public discourse increasingly rewards emotional performance over procedural consistency. Outrage becomes social currency. Moral language becomes identity reinforcement. Humiliation becomes acceptable if directed toward the correct symbolic enemy. Green Arrow exists comfortably inside that ecosystem because his politics allow audiences to emotionally separate his brutality from more visibly authoritarian characters. But symbolic alignment does not alter behavioral structure. A billionaire surveilling a city from hidden infrastructure while violently imposing personal moral judgment upon criminals remains psychologically close to authoritarian fantasy, regardless of ideological packaging. The language surrounding the force changes. The force itself often does not. This becomes especially apparent whenever Oliver Queen interacts with heroes positioned as more institutionally restrained. His frustration with legal systems, political bureaucracy, and procedural limitations repeatedly pushes him toward unilateral escalation. He distrusts moderation because moderation feels complicit in suffering. That emotional logic appears humane initially. Yet historically, many forms of authoritarian psychology emerge from precisely this conviction, the belief that ethical urgency justifies bypassing structural restraint. The vigilante stops seeing limits as protection against abuse and starts seeing them as obstacles preventing necessary action. And superhero universes are uniquely vulnerable to romanticizing that mentality because they operate through compressed moral timelines. Problems emerge rapidly. Intervention produces immediate visible results. Consequences remain narratively manageable. Real political systems appear slow, and compromised beside the seductive clarity of the masked figure imposing order through direct force. Green Arrow increasingly thrives inside that fantasy. Not because he abandons empathy, but because he fuses empathy with domination so completely that the distinction between protecting people and controlling them begins collapsing beneath the surface of the narrative itself. The next transformation occurs when Green Arrow stops functioning merely as a politically frustrated vigilante and begins operating as a symbolic moral authority inside the broader DC Comics universe. This shift is subtle at first. It emerges through dialogue, through positioning, through the way other heroes react to him. Oliver Queen increasingly becomes the character allowed to articulate the ethical critique that the narrative itself wants the audience to internalize. He is no longer simply a man fighting crime in Star City. He becomes the conscience standing in judgment over superheroes themselves. That elevation radically changes the psychological structure surrounding his violence, because moral authority creates emotional immunity. Once a character becomes culturally coded as ethically enlightened, audiences begin filtering their actions through presumed righteousness rather than observable behavior. Contradictions lose visibility. Aggression becomes easier to rationalize. Cruelty acquires interpretive flexibility. The symbolic crown protects the figure wearing it, and Oliver Queen wears that crown constantly. He challenges institutional power, questions militarization, criticizes surveillance states, condemns systemic injustice, opposes authoritarian tendencies within superhero organizations. On the surface, this positioning appears fundamentally incompatible with punitive vigilantism. Yet the contradiction persists because Oliver's worldview increasingly divides society into morally illuminated and morally corrupted territory. He distrusts centralized authority while continuously centralizing authority within himself. That tension becomes especially visible during moments when Green Arrow enters ideological conflict with heroes like Batman. The narrative often frames Bruce Wayne as emotionally repressed, paranoid, authoritarian, obsessed with control. Oliver serves as the emotionally human counterweight, the socially conscious corrective, the hero supposedly closer to ordinary people. But psychologically, both characters share a remarkably similar relationship to power. Batman externalizes fear through systems, surveillance networks, contingency plans, predictive control. Green Arrow externalizes outrage through confrontation, public moral aggression, punitive intervention. Bruce fears collapse. Oliver resents it. Yet both men increasingly position themselves above collective process, convinced that personal judgment must override institutional limitation. The difference lies primarily in emotional presentation. Batman appears cold. Green Arrow appears passionate. Batman's authoritarian tendencies are intentionally unsettling. Oliver's are often narratively softened through humor, charisma, and political rhetoric. But emotional warmth does not neutralize coercive psychology. In some ways, it can make it more persuasive. Audiences instinctively trust anger that appears rooted in empathy. That trust becomes culturally significant because modern superhero fiction increasingly operates as moral theater for fragmented political audiences. Characters are no longer consumed purely as fictional constructs. They become symbolic proxies inside real ideological conflict. Readers project identity into them, tribal belonging, moral aspiration. Green Arrow thrives within this environment because he speaks the emotional language many contemporary audiences already use to process social frustration. The problem is that outrage tends to radicalize faster than compassion once it becomes socially rewarded. And Oliver Queen is constantly rewarded for anger, not simply within stories, but through audience reception itself. His confrontational posture feels emotionally satisfying in periods where institutional trust collapses. The fantasy becomes seductive. The corrupt politician gets humiliated publicly. The exploitative billionaire gets threatened directly. The criminal receives immediate consequence rather than procedural delay. Green Arrow offers a world where moral frustration bypasses systemic paralysis entirely. But fantasies of bypassing process rarely remain stable. Over time, the emotional logic beneath them begins expanding. If institutional limitations prevent justice, then limitations themselves start appearing morally suspect. If urgency justifies coercion once, it becomes easier to justify repeatedly. The hero develops an increasingly personalized relationship with legitimacy. Action feels righteous because intention feels righteous. This is precisely where Green Arrow begins resembling the very structures he claims to oppose. Authoritarian psychology rarely presents itself internally as tyranny. It presents itself as necessity. The individual believes systems are too compromised, too corrupt, too slow, too indifferent to respond adequately to crisis. Therefore, intervention becomes morally mandatory. Oliver Queen repeatedly operates within that emotional framework. He distrusts institutional power while constructing a personalized version of it through vigilantism. And the narrative often treats this contradiction as evidence of complexity rather than warning. Part of this emerges from the superhero genre's deep discomfort with genuine political consequence. Comics frequently want the emotional intensity of radical critique without fully confronting what sustained coercive intervention would actually produce socially. So Green Arrow occupies a carefully protected symbolic position. He can criticize capitalism without destabilizing the structure of billionaire superheroes. He can oppose authoritarianism while operating as an unelected armed force. He can condemn systemic violence while continuously reproducing violence as solution. The genre protects him because he performs ideological balance. He reassures audiences that moral aggression can remain pure if emotionally framed correctly. That violence retains ethical legitimacy when exercised against sufficiently unsympathetic targets. That domination becomes humane once articulated through progressive language. And this is where the comparison to the Punisher grows increasingly uncomfortable for the broader culture surrounding superhero fiction. Frank Castle destabilizes audiences because he refuses moral camouflage. His violence strips away comforting rhetoric and exposes raw punitive desire directly. Readers may still romanticize him, but the text itself often acknowledges the corrosion. Green Arrow allows audiences to indulge similar emotional fantasies while preserving psychological distance from authoritarian self-perception. That distance matters enormously, because Oliver's brutality often appears socially conscious rather than nihilistic. He humiliates the corrupt, threatens exploiters, targets predators. His aggression carries ideological justification attached to recognizable social anxieties. Economic inequality, institutional abandonment, political hypocrisy. The audience does not merely watch him impose force. They watch him punish symbolic representations of collective frustration, which means the violence begins functioning emotionally as purification. The city becomes divided into contaminated and redeemable spaces. Certain individuals embody social decay, so completely that coercion against them feels not only acceptable, but emotionally restorative. The vigilante no longer appears as a man exercising dangerous unilateral authority. He appears as the immune response of the civic body itself. And immune responses can become destructive once they stop recognizing limits. This is why Green Arrow stories often drift toward escalating moral absolutism, even when attempting nuance. Oliver's worldview structurally rewards emotional certainty. Doubt slows intervention. Reflection complicates punishment. But the vigilante fantasy depends upon rapid moral clarity. Someone must deserve the arrow before the arrow can fly. Over time, this dynamic subtly transforms Oliver's relationship with ordinary people as well. He claims to fight for them constantly, yet increasingly, They exist less as fully realized citizens and more as symbolic justification for intervention. The suffering population becomes emotional evidence validating his authority. Their pain legitimizes escalation. Their vulnerability sanctifies his methods. This is not unique to Green Arrow. Many vigilante narratives operate similarly, but Oliver's rhetoric of compassion obscures the transformation more effectively than most. Because the stories continue insisting upon his moral enlightenment, even as his behavioral structure grows progressively harsher. And audiences often accept that framing, because modern media environments reward symbolic intention more heavily than procedural ethics. If a figure speaks correctly about injustice, contradictions beneath the surface become psychologically easier to ignore, especially when the targets of aggression already occupy socially demonized territory. Green Arrow increasingly depends upon that cultural mechanism. His politics become emotional insulation, protecting the audience from recognizing how much pleasure contemporary superhero morality often derives from righteous domination itself. Eventually, the contradiction surrounding Green Arrow stops operating merely at the level of character psychology and begins reshaping the moral atmosphere of the superhero genre itself. By this stage, the issue is no longer whether Oliver Queen personally resembles the Punisher in isolated moments of brutality. The deeper issue is that Green Arrow helps normalize a new cultural expectation surrounding heroism, the expectation that ethical legitimacy can permanently coexist with escalating coercive force as long as the rhetoric framing that force remains emotionally progressive. That shift alters the architecture of superhero morality in profound ways. Earlier heroic traditions often depended upon visible tension between power and restraint. The hero possessed force but feared becoming consumed by it. Moral legitimacy emerged through limitation. Superman could destroy the city, but chose not to. Batman walked constantly beside the abyss of lethal violence without crossing fully into it. The restraint itself became psychologically important because it acknowledged the corruptive gravity of domination. Green Arrow increasingly destabilizes that structure because his narratives often treat moral anger not as something requiring containment, but as evidence of authenticity. And authenticity has become one of the most powerful currencies in modern media culture. Audiences distrust polished idealism. They distrust institutional language. They distrust neutrality. Emotional intensity now reads as honesty. Outrage signals sincerity. A hero who appears furious at corruption feels more psychologically real than one maintaining symbolic distance from social collapse. Oliver Queen thrives within this emotional environment because he performs visible moral frustration constantly. He does not hover above society like a mythic savior. He reacts to it like an agitated citizen armed with impossible agency. But reactionary emotional structures rarely remain contained once culturally validated. Over time, Green Arrow stories begin collapsing the distinction between moral clarity and emotional escalation itself. The more intense Oliver's anger becomes, the more ethically committed he appears. Compassion transforms into fury almost seamlessly. The audience is encouraged to experience aggression as proof that the hero still cares deeply enough to feel wounded by injustice. This is psychologically dangerous because rage easily disguises itself as empathy once directed towards socially approved enemies. And superhero fiction increasingly depends upon that disguise. The genre no longer simply asks audiences to admire heroic sacrifice. It asks them to experience cathartic punishment alongside the hero. Corrupt figures are not merely defeated. They are publicly dismantled, humiliated, exposed, broken symbolically before they are broken physically. The city becomes theater. Justice becomes spectacle. Violence becomes emotionally participatory. Green Arrow functions perfectly within this evolution because his political rhetoric provides ethical framing for punitive pleasure. The audience can watch Oliver threaten, brutalize, or psychologically dominate targets while continuing to experience themselves as aligned with compassion rather than vengeance. That emotional fusion becomes central to the character's cultural durability. He offers the fantasy that one can indulge punitive desire without surrendering the self-image of moral sophistication, which is precisely why the stories so often resist interrogating his methods fully. If Green Arrow were forced into genuine confrontation with the authoritarian implications of his behavior, the broader fantasy sustaining much contemporary superhero morality would begin destabilizing alongside him. The genre depends increasingly upon heroes who exercise extraordinary coercive authority while remaining symbolically associated with liberation rather than control. This contradiction becomes especially visible in how Oliver Queen relates to surveillance. Narratively, Green Arrow frequently condemns invasive state power, corrupt policing, corporate control, authoritarian institutions. Yet his own vigilantism depends heavily on unilateral observation, monitoring criminal activity, tracking individuals, entering private spaces through force, gathering intelligence outside legal accountability. The difference, according to the narrative, lies in intention, but authoritarian systems throughout history have justified themselves through intention. The belief that force becomes morally purified through correct ideological motivation is one of the oldest political fantasies ever constructed. Green Arrow repeatedly reproduces that logic while simultaneously presenting himself as its opponent. The city accepts his intrusion because the narrative assures audiences his enemies deserve observation. The same mechanism appears again and again. Moral categorization first, exceptional force second, and once those categories harden, mercy becomes psychologically difficult. Because Oliver Queen increasingly experiences opposition, not merely as criminal behavior, but as symbolic betrayal of the social order he wishes existed. Criminals cease functioning as citizens capable of transformation and instead become manifestations of societal sickness. Corruption acquires almost metaphysical weight within the narrative. It contaminates space itself. Entire neighborhoods become symbolic ruins requiring intervention from outside ordinary civic process. That framing allows increasingly aggressive behavior to feel emotionally inevitable. The vigilante enters the city less like a citizen participating in collective repair and more like a corrective force descending upon occupied territory. Every arrow restores temporary order. Every confrontation reasserts moral hierarchy. Every defeated enemy symbolically reassures the audience that someone still possesses the will to impose consequence within a collapsing world. But this structure contains a profound psychological trap, because the hero slowly becomes dependent upon the persistence of corruption itself. Oliver Queen's identity derives enormous coherence from moral opposition. The city's failure validates his existence continuously. Its corruption provides emotional gravity. Without systemic injustice, the vigilante loses narrative centrality. This does not mean Green Arrow consciously desires suffering. Far from it. But psychologically, the self increasingly organizes around conflict until confrontation itself becomes inseparable from meaning. This is one of the quiet similarities he shares with Punisher. Both men require perpetual societal fracture to sustain the identities they inhabit. The difference lies in emotional framing. Frank Castle openly accepts endless war as permanent reality. Oliver Queen continues insisting upon restorative morality, even while operating through structures that continuously regenerate antagonism. And audiences prefer Oliver precisely because that contradiction remains emotionally comfortable. Punisher forces confrontation with punitive fantasy directly. Green Arrow allows audiences to experience punitive fantasy while preserving the illusion of ethical transcendence. The violence feels cleaner, smarter, more politically conscious. Yet structurally, both characters increasingly operate through personalized moral authority imposed onto civic space through force. The distinction between them narrows further whenever Green Arrow stories intensify their rhetoric surrounding systemic evil. Because the more morally catastrophic the enemy appears, the easier it becomes to justify escalation against them. The narrative creates emotional conditions where coercion no longer feels exceptional. It feels responsible. At that point, the vigilante ceases functioning as resistance against brutality and starts functioning as brutality, aesthetically reorganized into acceptable ideological form. And modern superhero culture rewards this transformation constantly. Characters who hesitate appear weak. Characters who maintain procedural ethics appear naive. Characters who refuse domination entirely risk seeming emotionally detached from real social anger. Green Arrow survives because he channels that anger aggressively enough to satisfy audience frustration, while still preserving the symbolic language of compassion around himself. But symbolic language cannot permanently contain behavioral truth. Eventually the pattern reveals itself. The hero who claims to oppose authoritarian logic increasingly behaves as though personal moral conviction grants exemption from structural restraint. The city becomes dependent on unilateral force exercised by emotionally certain individuals. Violence becomes narratively ethical once wrapped in correct rhetoric, and the audience learns to interpret domination not according to its structure, but according to whether they emotionally approve of the person exercising it. That may be the most important transformation Green Arrow reveals inside contemporary superhero mythology. Not the corruption of one vigilante, but the gradual cultural normalization of coercive morality disguised as enlightened conscience. The cultural significance of Green Arrow does not emerge primarily from popularity. Characters do not need to dominate sales charts or cinematic universes to become psychologically revealing. Sometimes the most important figures are the ones positioned at ideological crossroads, absorbing tensions too unstable for larger mythic icons to contain openly. Green Arrow functions precisely this way within modern superhero culture. He operates like a pressure fracture running through the center of contemporary liberal morality itself. Because Oliver Queen embodies a fantasy many audiences desperately want to believe remains possible. The fantasy that outrage can remain permanently ethical, not temporarily necessary, not tragically unavoidable, pure, morally elevated, socially conscious, emotionally intelligent. Green Arrow allows audiences to imagine that domination changes moral nature, once articulated through the language of empathy, justice, and systemic awareness. He offers the emotional satisfaction of punitive force without requiring identification with reactionary politics openly. That symbolic function became increasingly powerful during periods of intense political fragmentation across Western culture. Public trust in institutions eroded dramatically. Economic inequality widened. Social media transformed outrage into permanent performance. Political identity became less about governance and more about symbolic warfare conducted through visibility, humiliation, and emotional escalation. Under these conditions, audiences began craving heroes who mirrored their own frustration toward institutional paralysis. Oliver Queen adapted almost perfectly to that environment. Unlike older superheroes built around aspirational stability, Green Arrow speaks from inside collapse. He sounds exhausted by corruption, angry at inequality, disgusted with concentrated power. His emotional texture resembles the psychological atmosphere of contemporary political discourse itself. He does not reassure audiences that systems fundamentally work. He reassures them that anger toward those systems remains morally righteous. That distinction matters enormously, because modern media ecosystems reward emotional intensity far more effectively than procedural consistency. Visibility amplifies conflict. Algorithms privilege outrage. Public moral identity increasingly forms through opposition rather than construction. Under these conditions, Green Arrow stops functioning merely as a fictional vigilante and starts functioning as an emotional avatar for audiences attempting to reconcile compassion with aggression. And that reconciliation often fails structurally. The deeper problem within Green Arrow's mythology is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. It is psychological convergence. Over time, his methods begin resembling the authoritarian dynamics he claims to oppose because both emerge from similar emotional conditions: distrust toward institutions, moral urgency, frustration with procedural delay, desire for visible consequence, belief that existing systems are incapable of meaningful correction. This convergence appears repeatedly across modern political culture. Groups positioned against domination often reproduce domination, once emotionally convinced their cause remains inherently just. Moral certainty becomes armor against self-examination. Coercion begins feeling compassionate because it targets designated oppressors. Public humiliation transforms into ethical performance. Punishment becomes proof of sincerity. The language surrounding the force changes dramatically. The psychological structure beneath it often does not. Green Arrow embodies this contradiction with unusual clarity because the character remains narratively coded as enlightened throughout the process. The stories rarely frame Oliver as descending into darkness the way they might with characters like Batman or the Punisher. Instead, his aggression frequently appears validated by the moral corruption surrounding him. The world becomes so visibly broken that escalation starts feeling emotionally proportional. Audiences absorb the logic almost unconsciously. The harsher the injustice appears, the more legitimate coercive response becomes. Eventually, brutality itself acquires moral aesthetic value. This is one of the most significant transformations in modern superhero storytelling. Earlier heroic myths often treated violence as tragic necessity interrupting ethical order. Contemporary narratives increasingly treat violence as emotionally expressive authenticity. Heroes prove sincerity through intensity. Anger becomes evidence of moral investment. Calm restraint risks appearing detached or politically indifferent. Green Arrow thrives inside this symbolic shift because his entire identity depends upon visible emotional reaction to social injustice. The irony is that Oliver Queen often ends up reproducing a distinctly aristocratic relationship to civic space despite positioning himself rhetorically against elite power structures. He remains a billionaire imposing unilateral moral judgment upon society through superior resources, surveillance capacity, and weaponized force. His anti-establishment posture masks the extent to which vigilantism itself already represents concentration of authority outside democratic accountability. But audiences frequently overlook this contradiction because Green Arrow performs class betrayal symbolically. He rejects the emotional identity of his economic class. He speaks against exploitation. He critiques systems benefiting people like himself. That rhetorical alignment creates psychological permission for viewers to separate his methods from their authoritarian implications. The audience experiences him less as a ruler imposing order from above, and more as an ally fighting alongside ordinary people against corrupt systems. Yet the city beneath Green Arrow remains fundamentally organized through his personal authority. That symbolic structure reveals something uncomfortable about modern political psychology more broadly. Many contemporary audiences no longer trust institutions enough to believe meaningful change can emerge procedurally. As faith in collective systems deteriorates, fantasies of personalized intervention grow increasingly seductive. The heroic figure bypasses bureaucracy entirely. He acts decisively. He punishes visibly. He restores emotional coherence to a fractured world through direct force. This is why vigilante narratives continue thriving during periods of institutional distrust. They transform civic helplessness into symbolic agency. And Green Arrow specifically transforms progressive frustration into punitive fantasy without forcing audiences to identify openly with reactionary authoritarianism. That balancing act gives the character enormous cultural flexibility. Different readers project different meanings into him. Some see social conscience. Others see anti-establishment rebellion. Others see ethical anger liberated from institutional compromise. But beneath those projections lies a recurring psychological pattern. Oliver Queen consistently frames violence as morally acceptable when emotionally aligned with the suffering of socially approved victims. The criminal ceases functioning as an individual shaped by broader systemic conditions and instead becomes symbolic embodiment of societal contamination. This process allows audiences to experience coercion not as domination but as restoration. The city itself becomes psychologically divided terrain. Certain spaces appear abandoned by legitimate order and therefore open to exceptional force. Certain populations become narratively associated with corruption so consistently that aggressive intervention against them feels emotionally inevitable. Green Arrow patrols these symbolic frontiers constantly, occupying the unstable boundary between protector and occupier without the stories fully acknowledging how narrow that boundary has become. And because superhero fiction operates mythologically, these dynamics extend far beyond individual stories. Superheroes function as cultural mirrors reflecting collective fantasies about power, morality, justice, and identity. They reveal how societies imagine legitimate force. What kinds of violence feel acceptable? Which authorities remain trusted? Which fears dominate civic imagination? Green Arrow reveals a culture increasingly comfortable with coercive morality, as long as it arrives wrapped in emotionally progressive language. That revelation becomes even more significant when contrasted against figures like Superman. Superman traditionally symbolizes restraint, power disciplined by ethical hesitation, the fear of becoming tyrannical despite possessing godlike capacity. Green Arrow increasingly symbolizes something else entirely, moral anger liberated from hesitation, because hesitation itself begins appearing ethically insufficient within a collapsing world. And contemporary audiences often respond more intensely to Oliver's model than Clark Kent's. Not because they necessarily desire authoritarianism consciously, but because they crave emotional congruence between outrage and action. Superman's restraint can feel frustrating in eras dominated by visible corruption and political paralysis. Green Arrow offers immediate consequence, immediate confrontation, immediate catharsis. The danger is that catharsis rarely builds sustainable civic morality. It satisfies emotional pressure temporarily, while often reinforcing the very punitive structures it claims to resist. Green Arrow stories repeatedly circle this contradiction without fully resolving it, because modern culture itself remains trapped inside the same psychological tension. People desire compassion and domination simultaneously. They want justice to feel humane while also feeling emotionally satisfying. They want violence without guilt. Oliver Queen gives them that fantasy. And that may explain why the character remains so symbolically potent despite never occupying the absolute center of superhero mythology. He represents not heroic transcendence, but modern moral confusion itself. The inability to distinguish clearly between ethical resistance and righteous coercion, once political identity, becomes emotionally fused with anger. The lasting importance of Green Arrow has very little to do with archery, costumes, or even superhero spectacle itself. His permanence comes from the fact that he embodies a contradiction modern culture no longer knows how to resolve cleanly. The contradiction between compassion and punishment, between moral consciousness and domination, between the desire to protect society and the emotional satisfaction of watching enemies suffer inside it. That contradiction will likely outlive the character entirely, because Green Arrow reflects a civilization increasingly unsure whether justice still means restraint at all. Earlier heroic myths often depended upon the fear of becoming corrupted by power. That fear acted as psychological gravity, holding force in tension with responsibility. The hero mattered precisely because he recognized the danger within himself. But contemporary culture increasingly rewards certainty over hesitation, visibility over reflection, emotional intensity over procedural ethics. Under those conditions, Green Arrow evolves naturally into a myth for an age that distrusts institutions, yet remains deeply addicted to force. And the addiction rarely presents itself honestly. That is why Oliver Queen remains symbolically more unsettling than openly brutal vigilantes like the Punisher. Frank Castle externalizes violence so completely that audiences must confront the punitive fantasy directly. Green Arrow softens the same psychological structure through rhetoric of empathy, justice, and social awareness. He allows coercion to feel emotionally civilized. The danger is not that Oliver secretly becomes evil. The danger is that he often remains convinced of his own moral clarity throughout the escalation. That is the deeper tragedy hidden beneath the character's mythology. Green Arrow rarely experiences himself as authoritarian because his aggression emerges through genuine outrage towards suffering and corruption. His compassion is real. His frustration is real. His desire for justice is real. But sincerity does not neutralize domination. In many cases, it intensifies it by removing internal resistance. The individual stops questioning force because force feels emotionally aligned with virtue itself. And once virtue fuses completely with aggression, moral limits become difficult to preserve. This is why Oliver Queen increasingly functions less like a corrective to authoritarian superheroism and more like its contemporary evolution. He does not reject unilateral power. He repackages it, makes it emotionally accessible to audiences who might otherwise distrust overt displays of domination. His mythology suggests that violence remains ethically pure as long as it targets sufficiently immoral figures and speaks through the language of social conscience while doing so. Modern superhero culture depends heavily on this logic now. Heroes are expected to perform emotional outrage publicly. They must demonstrate visible awareness of injustice. Yet they are also expected to deliver cathartic consequence against symbolic enemies. The result is a genre where coercion no longer threatens heroic legitimacy. Instead, it often confirms it, especially when audiences already share the hero's ideological framing of the conflict. Green Arrow helped normalize that transformation. Not alone. The shift is much larger than any single character. But Oliver Queen occupies a uniquely revealing symbolic position because the contradiction remains so visible within him specifically. He claims to oppose brutality while repeatedly relying upon it emotionally. He condemns authoritarian structures while functioning through personalized authority. He speaks for ordinary people while imposing moral judgment upon society from above like an unelected civic force. And the stories surrounding him often continue presenting this not as warning, but as enlightenment. That narrative choice reveals how deeply contemporary culture now associates righteousness with emotional aggression. A calm hero risks appearing detached. A restrained hero risks appearing politically naive. A hero uncertain about imposing force risks appearing weak in the face of systemic collapse. Green Arrow survives because he offers a fantasy of morally validated anger capable of acting decisively within a world audiences increasingly perceive as broken beyond procedural repair. The city beneath him never truly recovers from that logic. Star City remains suspended in permanent tension, an urban frontier requiring continuous intervention from a vigilante emotionally sustained by conflict itself. Corruption regenerates endlessly because the mythology requires corruption structurally. Without societal fracture, Oliver Queen loses symbolic gravity. His identity depends upon inhabiting the boundary between outrage and authority continuously. and that boundary becomes thinner with every passing decade. Especially as real political culture grows more performative, more polarized, more dependent on public humiliation as moral spectacle. Green Arrow begins resembling not simply a superhero, but a prototype for how modern societies increasingly process justice emotionally. Through visibility, through confrontation, through symbolic punishment aimed at socially designated enemies. The audience no longer asks whether domination itself is dangerous. It asks whether the correct people are being dominated. That may be the most revealing legacy the character leaves behind. Not proof that liberal morality inevitably becomes authoritarian, but proof that any moral system can drift toward coercion once emotional certainty replaces structural restraint. Green Arrow exposes how easily compassion can become psychologically fused with punishment when outrage becomes identity and visibility becomes power. And perhaps that is why the character continues lingering so persistently within the cultural imagination despite never fully ascending to the mythic simplicity of heroes like Superman or Batman. Oliver Queen feels contemporary in a way older heroes often do not. He sounds like the modern world sounds. Frustrated, morally exhausted, furious at corruption, suspicious of institutions, hungry for justice, but increasingly uncertain what justice even means once systems stop feeling trustworthy. He embodies the emotional atmosphere of societies trapped between empathy and resentment, between civic collapse and fantasies of corrective force. And that is why the contradiction inside Green Arrow never resolves. Because the culture consuming him has not resolved it either. The arrow continues flying through the same fractured civic landscape, carrying with it the promise that violence can remain righteous indefinitely if spoken through the correct moral language. The city watches it cut across the sky like a verdict already decided before impact. And somewhere beneath the rhetoric of justice, the old vigilante instinct remains unchanged. The belief that moral certainty grants the right to rule the shadows.